June 26, 1944, Dutch New Guinea. At the edge of the humid airfield at Hollandia, a game of checkers sat half-finished on a wooden table, the pieces unmoved for several minutes. Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald looked up, his expression curious but wary. Standing in the doorway was a tall, lean man with a calm face and eyes that carried something between exhaustion and certainty. "Charles Lindbergh," the man said, introducing himself quietly. MacDonald blinked. The Charles Lindbergh? The first man to fly across the Atlantic? What was he doing in a dusty combat zone halfway around the world? In that unremarkable moment, in a sweltering hut surrounded by maps, mosquito nets, and laughter from the flight line, the United States Army Air Forces were about to undergo one of the most profound transformations of the Pacific Air War. Over the next 6 weeks, this 42-year-old civilian, barred from military service, distrusted by the White House, and technically forbidden from combat, would teach some of the deadliest fighter pilots in the world how to do something that every manual told them was impossible. He would show them how to double the range of the P-38 Lightning without adding a single drop of fuel. And by doing so, Charles Lindbergh, the man once accused of sympathizing with America's enemies, would change the way the Pacific War was fought. 17 years earlier, the world had first heard his name. In May of 1927, a silver monoplane called the Spirit of St. Louis lifted from Roosevelt Field and disappeared into the dawn sky. 33 hours later, it landed in Paris, the first solo flight across the Atlantic. That single act turned Lindbergh into a legend, but it also revealed something deeper than courage or celebrity. He was not just a pilot. He was an engineer in the cockpit, a man who thought in numbers, who could feel fuel burn rates in his fingertips. When his aircraft landed in France with only a few dozen gallons remaining, he had done the impossible not by luck, but through microscopic management of fuel, pressure, and airspeed. Every inch of throttle, every vibration of the propeller, he'd recorded, studied, and optimized. It was a mastery of energy efficiency decades ahead of its time. That obsession followed him throughout the 1930s as he flew transoceanic routes for Pan American Airways, surveying future flight paths over the Pacific and Atlantic. There, Lindbergh learned the hard truth that every published range figure for an airplane was a lie of simplicity, an average, not a boundary. He discovered that with perfect control of engine power and mixture, aircraft could stretch far beyond their stated limits. But the war would change everything. In the years before World War II, Lindbergh had become one of America's most controversial figures. As a public spokesman for the America First Committee, he had argued against US entry into the European War, a position that drew fury from President Franklin D. Roosevelt. When he criticized Roosevelt's foreign policy, the president compared him publicly to traitors from the Civil War. Under pressure and humiliation, Lindbergh resigned his commission as a colonel in the Army Air Corps Reserve in 1941. When Pearl Harbor erupted in flame, he tried to return to duty and was refused. Roosevelt himself ensured that Lindbergh would never again wear the uniform of his country. So, when war came, the most famous pilot in American history became a civilian on the sidelines. But talent has a way of finding the front line, even when forbidden. In 1943, Lindbergh joined United Aircraft Corporation as a technical consultant, working directly with the engineers at Chance Vought, the company that produced the F-4U Corsair. He flew test flights, solved production problems, and even developed new dive-bombing techniques. At Willow Run, he advised on B-24 bomber assembly. At Republic Aviation, he flew the P-47 Thunderbolt to study its high-altitude performance. Despite the political stigma, the Army quietly recognized that Lindbergh's technical brain was still valuable. His expertise in long-range flight could be the difference between success and failure across the Pacific, where airfields were scattered across thousands of miles of ocean. In early 1944, Lindbergh proposed something unprecedented: to travel to the South Pacific as a civilian consultant and study twin-engine fighter operations firsthand. The only American aircraft that fit that category was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, a plane renowned for its speed, firepower, and range, but also infamous for its thirst. The US Navy approved his journey without informing Roosevelt. His orders were vague, his presence unofficial. On paper, he was an observer, In practice, he would become something far more dangerous. By May of 1944, Lindbergh arrived at Marine bases scattered across the South Pacific, beginning with Guadalcanal. Within days, the Observer was flying live combat missions, strafing Japanese positions, leading strike formations, and teaching pilots how to carry heavier bomb loads safely. The Marines quickly realized that the man in civilian clothes knew more about their aircraft than most of their own instructors. He taught Corsair squadrons how to safely take off overloaded, by using precise power settings and throttle management rather than brute force. The result? Fewer crashes, longer range, and deadlier strikes. Word spread like wildfire. Charles Lindbergh was flying combat missions, unarmed by rank, armed by expertise. By June, his attention shifted to the twin-engine Lightning, the aircraft that fascinated him most. The P-38 was America's premier long-range fighter, fast and deadly, yet limited by one unforgiving factor: fuel. In the sprawling Pacific, that limitation was a death sentence. So Lindbergh travelled north to Dutch New Guinea, where the 475th Fighter Group, Satan's Angels, operated the latest P-38J models. He arrived unannounced on June 26th, walking straight into MacDonald's hut as the commander played checkers with his operations officer. When the introductions ended, MacDonald was sceptical. The 475th was already one of the best P-38 groups in the theatre. Its pilots were aces. What could a middle-aged civilian teach men who fought every day against the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force? Lindbergh didn't argue. He simply asked to fly. The next morning, he joined the squadron for a combat mission. It was his first time ever flying the P-38 in war. The target: enemy barges along the coast. He flew flawlessly, maintaining formation beside the unit's top ace, Major Thomas Maguire, a man whose quiet competitiveness masked one of the sharpest tactical minds in the Pacific. Lindbergh attacked the target, strafing with calm precision, then returned to base without a scratch. The crew chiefs noticed something peculiar when the planes landed. Lindbergh's P-38 still had fuel left, a lot of it. At first, the ground crews assumed an instrument error. Then it happened again, and again. Every time Lindbergh flew, his plane returned with nearly twice as much fuel remaining as the others, even though he'd flown the same route, the same speed, and the same combat pattern. Something was different. Something was revolutionary. A few days later, MacDonald gathered his pilots in the rough recreation hut, a structure built from bamboo, tarps, and sandbags. Under the dim yellow bulbs, Lindbergh stood at the front, chalk in hand. He didn't lecture. He explained. Calmly, methodically, he outlined how the engines of the P-38, the twin Allison V-1710s, were being misused by their own manuals. Pilots had been trained to cruise at 2,200 revolutions per minute, with the fuel mixture set to auto-rich. It was safe, simple, and inefficient. Lindbergh proposed something heretical. Drop the RPM down to 1,600, lean the mixture to auto-lean, and slightly increase manifold pressure to compensate. The room murmured. That combination, low RPM, high pressure, was forbidden in flight schools. Every manual warned that such over-square settings would cause detonation and destroy the engine. Lindbergh smiled. Not if you understand the engine, he said. He explained that power came from fuel burned efficiently, not wastefully. At lower RPM, the pistons cycled fewer times per second, each stroke burning its fuel more completely. Increasing manifold pressure restored power without increasing waste. It wasn't danger, it was balance, mechanical harmony. His math was simple but astonishing. With these settings, a P-38 could cruise 400 miles farther than before, turning 7-hour missions into 9. That meant reaching targets once thought untouchable, and coming home with fuel to fight. Silence filled the hut. The pilots didn't know whether to laugh or argue. Some thought the civilian was insane. Others, including MacDonald, suspected he was right. And in war, only results mattered. In the days that followed, the 475th began to test Lindbergh's theory. Cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. The engines ran differently, yes, deeper, slower, more rhythmic, but cooler. Temperatures stayed within limits. Oil pressure remained perfect. The planes no longer trembled at cruise, and when they landed, the numbers on the gauges told the story. Massive fuel savings without a single mechanical failure. What had seemed impossible, extending the Lightning's range by hundreds of miles without modification, had become reality. By early July, Lindbergh's methods spread across the group. Pilots who had doubted him now swore by his settings. They flew longer, fought longer, and returned home safer. In less than a month, a civilian with no rank had quietly revolutionized fighter operations across the Pacific. The transformation was so complete that by mid-July, even the most skeptical pilots of the 475th were quietly adopting Lindbergh's civilian gospel. The results spoke for themselves. Missions that once demanded desperate fuel management now ended with extra reserves. Flights that previously ended in forced landings could stretch hundreds of miles farther and still return safely. The P-38 Lightning, already a formidable twin-engine Predator, had been given new wings of endurance. Yet for the men who flew these machines, what mattered most was that the man teaching them didn't just talk about efficiency, he lived it. Lindbergh joined every mission he could, sitting shoulder to shoulder with younger pilots half his age. They watched him work the throttles like an artist, coaxing more distance from every drop of fuel, never pushing the engines harder than necessary, never wasting energy. It wasn't just knowledge, it was discipline, the kind that only experience and a deep understanding of machinery could create. He wasn't a celebrity here, he was one of them. When Lindbergh climbed into the cockpit, even the aces, Major Thomas Maguire, Lieutenant Colonel MacDonald, watched with the same curiosity they reserved for enemy tactics. His mastery of flight had transcended theory. He was rewriting how war was fought, one engine cycle at a time. Then came July 28th, 1944, a mission that would cement Lindbergh's strange, secret place in military history. The target lay near the Seram area, over a stretch of shimmering blue sea off New Guinea. 4 P-38s from the 433rd Squadron took off that morning. MacDonald, Maguire, Captain Danforth Miller, and the civilian no one officially acknowledged, Mr. Lindbergh. They flew escort for bombers, but over El Piti Bay, things changed. 2 Japanese reconnaissance bombers, Mitsubishi Ki-51 Sonias, appeared below them, heading home after a patrol. The Japanese aircraft was slower and lightly armed, but flown by experienced men who understood survival in hostile skies. One of them was Captain Saburo Shimada, the commanding officer of his squadron. The Americans dove. The fight unfolded fast, P-38 screaming down in twin contrails, guns flashing silver. One Sonia burst into flames, spiraling toward the ocean. The other, Shimada's, refused to die. He threw his plane into sharp, brutal turns, each one so tight that condensation trails spiraled from his wingtips. The Americans fired again and again, but Shimada twisted through their bullets with the desperation of a man fighting for his nation's last breath. Then Lindbergh saw him. The 2 aircraft faced each other in the sky, closing at terrifying speed. The Japanese pilot flew straight at him. Lindbergh didn't hesitate. He sighted down the nose of his Lightning, centered the enemy's spinning propeller, and pulled the trigger. The P-38's nose erupted with fire, 120mm cannon and 4.50 caliber machine guns pouring death into the oncoming Sonia. For 6 seconds, both men committed to the same fatal trajectory. Then, at the last instant, Lindbergh yanked his control column back, and his Lightning screamed over the crippled bomber as its engine tore apart. The Japanese aircraft nosed downward, trailing black smoke before smashing into the Pacific. The explosion echoed faintly through Lindbergh's headset, and then silence, only the deep growl of twin Allisons carrying him home. Back at Hollandia, the victory was discussed quietly. Several pilots had fired at Shimada's plane, but everyone knew whose burst had sealed its fate. Officially, there could be no recognition. Lindbergh was a civilian. His kill would never appear in combat reports. Unofficially, among the pilots of Satan's Angels, it was clear. The old man had earned his place. That day, Charles Lindbergh, the man who had once crossed the Atlantic alone, became a combat pilot again. 3 days later, On August 1st, he nearly died. The mission was a long-range fighter sweep to the Plow Islands. Over enemy territory, Lindbergh found himself in a turning fight with the Japanese Zero, one of the deadliest single-engine fighters in the world. The Zero's tight turning radius gave its pilot the advantage. For a few seconds, tracer fire flashed past Lindbergh's canopy, close enough to scorch the paint on his tail. Only MacDonald's urgent voice over the radio, "Brake right, brake right," and his own intervention saved Lindbergh's life. The colonel cut off the attacker and shot it down himself. When they landed, the message from headquarters was clear. The experiment had gone far enough. Lindbergh had flown nearly 50 combat missions in total, about half of them in the P-38. He had taught, tested, fought, and survived. He had proved his theories in the most dangerous classroom imaginable, and the Air Force could not risk losing him. Within weeks, orders arrived to send him home. On August 12, 1944, Charles Lindbergh left New Guinea as quietly as he had arrived. The pilots of the 475th gathered to see him off, a mix of respect and disbelief in their eyes. The man who had once been vilified by his own country had earned their admiration not through fame, but through courage and proof. He had changed their world. What he left behind was not a speech or a memo. It was a new way of flying. By October, nearly every P-38 group in the Pacific had adopted some version of his method. The exact numbers varied slightly between aircraft and weather conditions, but the principle was always the same: lower RPM, leaner fuel mixture, higher manifold pressure. A more patient engine, a smarter pilot, and a longer reach. The difference was transformational. Missions that had once stretched to their limits now seemed manageable. Japanese bases that had been out of reach suddenly found themselves within the Lightning's claws. The new cruising technique allowed P-38s to escort bombers across distances that had been considered impossible months earlier. They could now reach targets more than 900 miles away, fight for 15 minutes, and return safely to base. Each gallon saved meant more firepower in the air, more pilots coming home. In the skies over the Pacific, range was survival, and Lindbergh had given them both. His technique did not just change fuel economy, it changed strategy. Commanders who had once planned around limited fighter support began to push deeper into enemy territory. The extended reach of the P-38 gave General Douglas MacArthur the flexibility to advance faster along his island-hopping campaign. Bases that had been thought unusable suddenly became forward airfields. The front line leaped forward hundreds of miles, powered by nothing more than math, courage, and a new understanding of combustion. Even those who had once doubted Lindbergh now admitted that he had achieved something extraordinary. Maintenance officers examined the engines that had flown with his settings and found no increased wear. The mechanics, once skeptical of the over-square nonsense, began to trust the data. Flight logs told the story clearly: fuel savings of 30% or more, no loss of reliability. It was, in military terms, a miracle made mechanical. Officially, the Army Air Forces soon incorporated the new cruise procedure into its manuals. Lindbergh's heresy became doctrine. The P-38's official range numbers were quietly updated. Training schools began teaching lean mixture control. In less than 6 months, what had begun as the private experiment of an unwanted pilot had become a cornerstone of aerial warfare in the Pacific. For Lindbergh himself, the change was personal. He had entered the war as an outcast, condemned by politics and mistrust. He left it as a teacher, respected by the men who mattered most, the ones who flew. Major Richard Bong, America's top ace with 40 victories, would later say, "Lindbergh was as good as any of us. If they'd let him stay, he'd have been out there knocking down Japs every day." Coming from Bong, it was the highest praise a pilot could receive. When Lindbergh returned to the United States, his reputation had shifted. Official Washington remained silent. Roosevelt still refused to acknowledge him, but among airmen, his name carried new weight. He continued to work as a technical consultant, attending conferences, flying captured Japanese aircraft, and advising manufacturers on performance and range. His reports were calm, precise, and written in the same measured tone that had once carried him across the Atlantic. He never boasted about what he had done. He didn't need to. The results spoke louder than any medal could. The numbers told the truth. A P-38 Lightning, flown with Lindbergh's cruise settings, could travel over 1,000 miles on a single mission. It could escort bombers, strike distant targets, and return with fuel to spare. In a theatre defined by ocean distances and isolation, that capability changed everything. The Pacific War had always been a contest of logistics, a struggle not just of courage, but of endurance. Lindbergh's innovation gave the Allies more of both. It saved fuel, time, and lives. It allowed men to fight farther and still come home. It gave the US Army Air Forces a weapon not just of firepower, but of persistence. Years later, historians would describe his contribution as a minor technical adjustment. But the pilots who flew with him knew better. In war, small adjustments can mean the difference between victory and death. Lindbergh's discovery wasn't just about engines. It was about trust, precision, and the courage to challenge accepted truth. He had done what few men could, faced a room full of combat veterans and convinced them to rethink everything they had been taught. And then he had risked his life to prove it. The rest of his story would unfold quietly. He continued flying, consulting, and writing, always returning to the same idea that had guided him since 1927. Knowledge, properly applied, can push the limits of what seems possible. When he died 3 decades later in Hawaii, his tombstone bore a single verse from the Book of Psalms. "If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, it was both a prayer and a truth." In 1944, over those same seas, Charles Lindbergh had done exactly that. Taken the wings of the morning and shown that even in the chaos of war, mastery and understanding could change the world. Even after Lindbergh left New Guinea, his presence lingered like the low hum of engines after shutdown. The pilots who had flown beside him felt the difference every time they opened the throttles for takeoff. The technique he'd taught them, so deceptively simple, had become second nature. When the mission stretched beyond the horizon, when they watched the fuel gauges drop mile after mile, they trusted his method more than the manuals, and as the Pacific campaign surged westward, the full impact of what he'd done began to unfold. In the months following his departure, the 5th Air Force grew bolder. With the Lightning's extended reach, missions no longer ended at the edge of the map. P-38S escorted bombers deep into the Philippines, beyond what had once been considered suicide range. They struck airfields, convoys, and fuel depots that had been safe under the old limits of distance. Japanese commanders, who had calculated safety by geography, now found their strongholds vulnerable to attacks from invisible directions. Range had become a weapon, and Lindbergh had forged it. When MacArthur's forces landed at Leyte that October, the sky above the invasion fleet roared with American fighters, many of them P-38s flying almost 1,000 miles round trip. The pilots no longer feared the long flight home. They knew their engines could take them there. It was subtle, quiet power, the kind that shifts the balance of a war without anyone realizing it until much later. The benefits weren't just strategic, they were human. Pilots who once returned on fumes now came home with a safety margin. Weather that would have doomed a flight was now survivable. Men who might have vanished into the Pacific came back alive, their tanks still whispering with reserve fuel. Every saved drop was a victory. Every extra mile flown proof that understanding, not brute force, wins wars. By the end of 1944, the P-38 Lightning had evolved into the true long-range fighter the Pacific needed. Its sleek twin booms cut through the sky from the Solomons to the Philippines, from New Guinea to Formosa. The aircraft that had once been limited by its hunger for fuel had become the hunter. And somewhere behind that transformation was the quiet figure of a civilian who refused to accept the word impossible. But the story did not end in the tropics. When Lindbergh returned to the United States, he carried with him more than flight logs and fuel charts. He carried redemption, earned not through politics but through performance. Washington remained cautious, even cold. Roosevelt never acknowledged what Lindbergh had done, perhaps unwilling to grant legitimacy to a man he had once condemned. Yet among aviators, his reputation had changed completely. In hangars and officers' clubs from Hawaii to California, pilots told stories of the day the old man showed them how to fly farther than anyone thought possible. They spoke of him with a mix of respect and awe, not as a hero of headlines, but as a master craftsman who had turned knowledge into survival. In the months that followed, Lindbergh continued to work quietly for the military as a civilian consultant. He attended performance conferences at Patuxent River, test flew captured Japanese aircraft, and wrote technical reports on efficiency and range. His findings helped refine American aviation for the next generation of aircraft, jets, bombers, even transport planes. Always the same principle repeated: precision, economy, understanding. He rarely mentioned the combat missions and never claimed official credit for his kill. To him, the achievement had never been about glory. It was about proving a point, that with enough knowledge, any limit could be moved. Engineers began to realize that the same principles Lindbergh applied to piston engines, balancing pressure, combustion, and mechanical harmony, would guide the emerging jet age. In that sense, his lessons reached far beyond the war. They were about the relationship between human judgment and machine potential, about listening to the rhythm of an engine instead of fighting it. The pilots of the 475th never forgot that. Decades later, when veterans were interviewed about those months in 1944, they still spoke of the quiet man who arrived without orders and changed everything. Some remembered his calm during takeoff, his measured voice over the radio, his ability to make flying seem effortless. Others recalled how he could explain complex physics in a single sentence: "Don't fight the air, it always wins." For them, Lindbergh wasn't a celebrity. He was proof that experience mattered more than image. The Lightning pilots had lived through something rare in war: a civilian walking into the heart of combat and teaching soldiers a better way to survive it. That trust between theory and practice became one of the hidden strengths of the American war effort. The collaboration between engineers and warriors, factories and airfields. The P-38 was the perfect symbol of that alliance: beautiful, over-engineered, deadly, and efficient. And in the summer of 1944, under the equatorial sun, it had become a bridge between two worlds, science and combat, because one man believed there was still more to learn. By the time the war ended, the Lightning had flown nearly every type of mission imaginable: escort, interception, reconnaissance, bombing, and ground attack. Its pilots destroyed thousands of Japanese aircraft and hundreds of ships. The 475th Fighter Group alone claimed more than 500 aerial victories. Men like Thomas Maguire and Richard Bong became legends, but even they admitted that their aircraft's final, perfected form owed much to the lessons Lindbergh had left behind. After the war, as the world turned its eyes toward jets and rockets, the age of the propeller seemed to fade. Many of the old Lightnings were scrapped, their aluminum melted down to build the next generation of machines. But their legacy remained, encoded in the invisible math of flight performance, in the manuals that still echoed Lindbergh's philosophy: lower speed, higher efficiency, longer reach. The same ideas would later define commercial aviation and space exploration. Quietly, the man once silenced by politics had shaped the future again. In his final years, Lindbergh retreated from public life. The crowds that had once cheered his name were long gone, replaced by a quieter admiration from those who understood what he had truly accomplished. When he died in Hawaii in 1974, he chose a resting place as remote and humble as the outposts he had flown from, beneath a simple stone near the ocean, marked with words from the Book of Psalms: "If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea." It was a line that captured his life more perfectly than any biography ever could. From the cold skies over the Atlantic to the burning jungles of the Pacific, Lindbergh had spent his life chasing the edge of endurance. He had proven that mastery is not about defiance, but about understanding. The ability to see limits not as walls, but as lines drawn by those who stopped learning too soon. His work in the Pacific was never officially recognized, but its effects rippled through generations of aviators who flew farther, safer, and smarter because of him. And that may be the purest form of victory, to change the world without needing credit for it. In the end, Charles Lindbergh's greatest flight wasn't the one that made him famous. It was the one that no one saw, across the empty blue of the Pacific, where a civilian in a borrowed cockpit taught warriors to trust numbers over instinct and knowledge over fear. He had crossed another ocean, not between continents this time, but between what men thought was possible and what truly was. That is where his legend rests, not in the roar of engines, but in the quiet realization that even in war, understanding is the ultimate weapon.